Okay, back for chapter 6, which is on deviance or deviance and social control. Let's take a look at the PowerPoint. We'll also talk a little bit about the criminal justice system, which typically fits into this category. Okay, so right off the bat, you can see mostly when we think of deviance, we tend to think of a jailbird, a criminal, a felon. We tend to think of deviance as a bad behavior. Okay, and so we're going to, this is of course, a social construction, right? That's a symbol that you see on the screen. And that symbol, of course, we give meaning to that. The fact that we have the word deviance, and that is a symbol that maybe connects to the meaning of the word deviance, is also a social construction. So we'll talk, which is interactionism or symbolic interaction approach. So we'll talk about that as we move on. So let's get into our discussions of deviant social control. We'll talk about deviant theories, and then we'll talk about the criminal justice system. So let's define deviance first. So deviance, it's a behavior, trait, or belief. Okay, a behavior, trait, or belief, not just a behavior or an action, but also a trait, like a physical trait or a presentation of self in some kind of way that it is, sometimes it can be voluntary, sometimes it could be involuntary, right? A trait or a belief or other characteristics, right? Characteristics maybe like what I'm wearing or that violate a norm, right? Which is socially constructed, right? And causes, right? As a result of that violation of a norm, causes a negative reaction, or sometimes what we call a sanction, right? A sanction, okay? So you have your social norms, okay, that are based on social norms of normal behavior, normal traits, normal beliefs, normal other characteristics. And when something violates those normal behaviors, traits, beliefs, and characteristics, when they violate that norm, okay, you're deviating from the norm, right? That's what social deviance is deviating from the socially constructed norm, right? And that causes a reaction, right? If you ever step into an elevator and you face the wrong way, of course, who determined what the right way to stand in the elevator is, right? Who determines the wrong way? Well, the wrong way defines the right way. And if you violate the right way or the social norm, you're going to get, right, some pushback, some feedback, some, not always, but you're going to get, certainly people are going to some degree, right? And the more you violate that social norm, the further out you get as an outlier from the norm, the more you put yourself at risk of being sanctioned in a heavier way, right? So the more heinous the crime, the more heinous the sanction. And again, even the consequences of the violation of a social norm is also socially constructed, right? So again, we might even think of deviant, the ABCs of deviance: attitude being thinking or belief, attitude, right? Thinking or belief; behavior being behavior; and condition, right? Being trait or other characteristics of how we look. Attitude, behavior, condition, the ABCs of deviance. That's another way to think of it, but it's behavior, traits, and beliefs. So obviously these two people are robbing the bank, right? That's typically what we think of when we think about social deviance. And of course, these are traits, right, or conditions or characteristics, right, that how we present ourselves, right, whether it's formal, informal, well, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, right? An involuntary trait or characteristic might be, you might have a prosthetic limb, or you might have scarring, right, that somebody gave you, or that you an accident that happened, or it could be tattoos or piercings, right, that you, or your hair color or your hairstyle or your clothing, right? Lots of things could be traits, right? But those are some examples of traits, right? And again, those are socially constructed as to what's deviant. As far as beliefs, right, here's a picture of an Amish couple, right? And so their belief of not using electricity and their religious beliefs that go along with that perspective, right, puts them in a category of violating the social norm. Okay, Scientology, Tom Cruise got a lot of pushback over the years when he mentions his faith, because it is a belief, right, that deviates from the social norm. Mormons, way back in the, I think it was around the 1800s, settled in Ohio. Before they got to Utah, they settled in Ohio, and that was considered a deviant belief. And there were laws passed in Ohio that said that they must leave the state of Ohio, or their property would be they would be taken out of their homes and taken out of the state, and their property would be confiscated, right? And that's when most Mormons tended to leave Ohio. Many of them, most of them settled in Utah. And so, yeah, just very interesting, the history, not only of the United States, right, but the history of humanity, right? I mean, social deviance isn't just a United States issue, right? Social deviance and how we is a human issue that has spanned time and place, and time and place matter in deviance, right? So at certain times of the day, at certain times in history, at certain times of the year, certain times of the week, some behaviors are okay. The same behavior may be okay at a certain time or place and may not be okay at a different time or place, right? Can you think of something? For example, I used to do a project, a deviance project for my students, and to violate the social norm. And I had a student that wore a bikini under a trench coat into a Catholic mass on Sunday morning. Well, when she took the trench coat off and revealed that she was wearing a bikini, she was immediately seen as violating the social norm and was sanctioned and escorted out by the ushers, right? That is, wearing a bikini is fine, right, on a beach during the daytime, probably, right? Not too many people are going to say much of it's night, but certainly it's very appropriate to wear a bikini on the beach, on most beaches during most daylight places in most countries, but not all. But it certainly wasn't the right time and place to wear a bikini in church at mass on Sunday morning. So that's an example of time and place matter, right? Okay. So let's talk about the deviant theories, right? So how does functionalism see deviance? Well, it sees deviance as a helper to society, that it helps society clarify social norms, right? When do you know that you violated a social norm? When you get what? A sanction or a reaction. When you get a reaction, you know you've gone further outside the box of the social norm. And really, that clarifies and defines the boundaries of social norms, right? We don't know what a social norm is until we get a reaction. And so deviant behavior helps to clarify or define the social norms and the boundaries of the social norms. Deviance and social norms. Deviance helps promote social cohesion. How do deviance or social norms help promote stability and solidarity or social cohesion? Well, because if you're sanctioned for violating the norm, right, it encourages people to what? Encourages people to adhere to the social norms, which brings more stability and solidarity because it tends to be supported by the majority of society, right? So the majority of society kind of tend to get together. Now, again, different places have different social norms, right? Murder is probably the one typically universal deviant behavior that's recognized through human time and history. But how murder is defined is even very interesting, and that changes over time in different places. It's different in different cultures, different times. So also deviance is a form of social control as opposed to anomy. So Durkheim, right, says that, and he was the functionalist seminal thinker behind deviant theories of functionalism. He says without any social controls, without any defined socially constructed social norms, right, without any defined deviance to create these social norms, there would be what? No rules, formal, informal, no norms, and you would have what he calls anomy or anomy, right, which means structureless or lawless, or you'd have another way that we might say it is you'd have anarchy, right? You'd have anything goes, all's fair in love and war. So a certain amount of social control from a functionalist perspective, right? A certain amount of social control, right, is good for society. It provides stability and solidarity, okay? And here's a graph, right? So we have these range of tolerance, that there's the norm and conforming, and then you move further out and it's a little over the norm, and then, you know, which is kind of in that gray area, and then you move even further out, and man, then you're deviant, right? So the more outlier you are from the socially constructed norm, right, and that can change over time, right, then you put yourself at greater risk, right, individually, right, for being sanctioned. But those sanctions help what? Help to bring about conformity to the social norm, right, which provides stability. Like we as a society tend to, in general, believe murder is wrong, stealing is wrong. You know, those are two real simple, easy ones, right? And everybody kind of, most people, not everybody, but most people agree. So when you violate those social norms, you know, you're going to get sanctioned, in this case, formal sanctions, right, by law. Okay, what about hairy women and deviant? Why or why not, right? Are hairy armpits deviant on women? Is the woman on the right, is she violating the social norms? May also depend on place. I mean, maybe not so much in Portland or in Oregon, probably in the Northeast, or maybe in the South, maybe in Texas. I don't know. I'm sure there's some places, right, where it is more deviant than other places. And what about when someone violates that social, and this is what we call soft deviance, right? Sociologists like to look at soft deviance, criminologists, right? Because this is the area where criminal justice and sociology kind of overlap, right? Where criminology, right, which is the study of more formalized deviance, right? So sociologists will look at a little bit of formal. We acknowledge formal deviance as well as informal. We probably spend a little bit more time, at least as the trend has been the last decade, looking at soft deviance, right? So this would be more of a soft deviance, but you can still apply the concepts. And I'll let you think about that a little bit more. Okay, deviant theories, right? So we looked at functionalism. Let's look at social control theory. Okay, so social control theory, it is why, not why do people do it. So a lot of times in the study of deviance, right, historically we've thought, you know, well, it's the bad seed, like a physical genetic character before genes. It's like, you know, that person's a bad seed, they're evil, or maybe they were possessed, or the thought that, you know, that we have, you know, this struggle of good and evil going on inside of us, right? And then there was like the psychological studies of deviance of, and so people, you know, the general idea, and then sociology comes along and we start looking at what are the social influences, right, of deviance and the complexities of that. But the question at the root of all this seems to be, where is deviance located? Right? So religiously, maybe deviance from a Christian perspective, or evil or bad, was located in the soul or the spirit or the heart. Other religions and philosophies, like a demon was attached to you. Psychology, it's deviance is located in the mind, or in the mental health issues of the mind. There were biological studies of like measuring body types or skull types or physical characteristics that could predict deviant behavior. It was rooted in the physical body, the biology. Sociology, we're going to look at like where is deviance rooted within society, right? So social deviant theory, social control theory, not why they do it, rather why don't they do it? Okay, and so Travis Hershey, a pretty well-renowned sociologist, talked about why do people conform to behaviors, or why do they deviate into criminal behaviors? And he said, the more that a society promotes and provides attachment for people in a society, so the more focused on community, family, and friends attachment, then the more that that's in place, the more conforming the behavior. The less focused on attachment to family, friends, and community, right? Which makes sense, right? Because the more I'm attached to community, the less I'm going to harm my family, friends, and people in my community, right? And then also he looked at commitment. So the more we can, as a society, right, the more we can promote a commitment to people's individual futures, career, success, personal growth, the more we kind of infuse that social construction of commitment into society, the more conforming behaviors, good behaviors, what we socially construct as good behaviors, we're going to have. The less commitment that we have, or the more hopeless we feel toward our future, our career, our success, our personal growth, the more criminal behavior you're going to get. Okay, then belief, right? So as a society values or believes, right, a value or belief in, ethics, morality, honesty, fairness, patriotism, responsibility. The more we as a society promote that culture of belief of those, as an example, those things, then the more conforming behavior you're going to have to society. The more that degrades itself, the less we buy into that, the more criminal behavior. Okay, and then Hershey finally finishes with involvement. The more we promote and encourage and provide opportunity for involvement in school activity, like sports teams or community organizations, religious groups, social clubs, which is part of the socialization process, right? The more involvement we have in those things, the less isolated we are, the more we're involved in those good projects, the more conforming to social behaviors, right? To socially constructed behaviors. The less we are involved in those, the more criminal behavior, right? So Hershey would say that deviance is located in society where there is a lack of reasons to comply to the social norms. Okay, that's Travis Hershey, right? And on a micro basis, we can see social control theory come out in, if there's a cop on the side of the bin bypass with a radar, and you see that cop down the way, you're going to what? The fact that there's something there, right? Social control mechanism there, or, if there's like cameras, security cameras in a house or in a business, like say a 7-Eleven, the less likely people are going to be, that's part of social control, right? So more social control, the less people tend to break the law, right? Travis Hershey's more macro perspective, same idea, but more of a macro cultural perspective. Okay, structural strain theory, right? So this is Thomas Merton. Merton's strain theory, right, was a failure to achieve the American dream. So he kind of launched off of Durkheim's idea of functionalism, So Merton was a big believer, you know, that um, that creating this American dream and the social norm of behaviors encouraged people, you know, to comply, which provided and promoted a social stability and solidarity. But he said if it gets too, if the and let me pull this up here. So if the institutionalized means, right, of climbing the social ladder and the cultural goals, right, the American dream of, I don't know, a house, a property, a job, a picket fence, right, if that's the goal, right, and the means to that goal, hard work, right, at some point, there are people that feel disenfranchised about their ability to achieve that goal in that institutionalized mean of hard work or that ladder to success, right? Then they will deviate. If it gets too difficult or too challenging, people will deviate from, right, the social norm, right? So let's take a look. So if I accept, and let's just say the cultural goal is the American dream, or let's call it the house on the hill, right? The crib, the lifestyles of the rich and famous, right? Whatever that cultural goal looks like, and sometimes those can change, right? But so conformity, excuse me, conformity to the goal and conformity to institutional means, you accept those, that's conformity, like, right? If I accept the goal, right, the house, the McMansion on the hill, but I reject the institutionalized mean, I'm going to become an innovator. So I'm going to get to that house on the hill, right? But I'm not going to do it through hard work. And today we'll add education. So hard work and education, hard work and education, hard work and education, right? I'm going to innovate, right? And so I might sell drugs, or I might be a pimp in a prostitution. I might be a sex slave trader, right? Or rob banks to get that house on the hill, right? I'm going to innovate. Now, it could also be innovation in a good way, in that maybe you come up with a new business model like FedEx, delivering, you know, overnight delivery, right? That was an innovation, right? Okay. So what if I reject the way to get there, and I also reject the cultural goals? I'm going to retreat, right? I'm going to say I reject the goal of the house on the hill, and I reject the means, the education and hard work. I'm going to check out. I'm going to kind of check out. I'm going to couch surf. I'm going to wake up, maybe spark up a bit of a hit off a bong, watch, you know, do a little Netflix binge. I'm going to retreat, right? I'm going to retreat. Okay. And now if I reject the cultural goal of the house on the hill, but I accept the institutional means, I'm just kind of going through the motions, right? I'm hardworking, going to school. Sometimes I'll ask students like, so why are you going to college? I don't know. It's what I'm supposed to do. Well, what are your goals? I don't know. I'm just at school because I'm supposed to be, right? That's ritualism, right? They're ritually going through the steps that society has what socialized in them as the socialized norm, right? Now, if you can read not only outside, Merton also said, hey, I'm going to a new means and a new goal, and he called that rebellion, right? Sometimes organized crime can be rebellion, right? A new goal, right? And a new means. The Amish can be a new means and a new goal. I think to some degree, right, the millennials and the Z generation are kind of saying to some degree, I think at least to some degree, I'm going to reject kind of the rat race way that my parents did things. And, you know, I'm going to do more of a work-life balance. I'm going to travel early instead of retire at 65 and buy the trailer or motorhome and travel, or so yeah, it's kind of interesting, I think, to some degree, and would be curious to hear what you guys think. But yeah, I think there's a bit of a rebellion, and I think that's not unusual generationally. You know, I think that's as old as what we see sometimes in the Greek plays, right? Okay, so Deviant theories, conflict theory. Okay, we're going to move to conflict theory. Okay, the conflict perspective, right? That the powerful, right, at the top of the food chain have the greatest influence on laws. And these laws tend to protect their position or the status quo, because the status quo of how things are working has put them and kept them in power, and they like that power, and it kind of works for them. And so they're going to protect and maintain the status quo from changes brought on by the impoverished, right, or the oppressed, right? In this case, from a economic perspective, the poor, right? Yeah, so that's kind of the conflict perspective, right, in a general sense. Now, also, there's a feminist perspective which fits under conflict theory, that gender role socialization influences behavior, right? So when you think of a rape culture or a toxic masculinity culture, right, those are gender role socialization, right? Of what does it mean, and we'll talk more about that when we get into gender, but what does it mean to be a male or a man? What does it mean to be female or a woman, right? And we're socialized, brought up, trained up to be those socially constructed play those roles, right? And that status, right? Okay, which we talked about in the last chapter a little bit. So yeah, kind of interesting as far as the criminal justice system. Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you look at gender roles, right, within the criminal justice system. Not sure that within the criminal justice system that males are privileged in the criminal justice system. You know, which still comes out of gender roles and our social construction to a great degree. Okay, and then there's critical race theory. So white supremacy and racial power are maintained, right? Again, kind of that status quo is maintained over time through the criminal justice system. Now, critical race theory started as a study associated with Harvard, right? Law school, right? Looking at laws that disproportionately affected one group as opposed to other groups. So where the same law disproportionately affected, in the case of critical race theory, blacks as opposed to whites. An example would be the study of crack, the violation of crack laws and the penalties as compared to the violation of powder cocaine laws and the penalties there is a common example of that. Now, it's far more complex than slogans, opinions. You know, you got to really dig into, and we can do that in class, but you got to really dig into that concept. And you start to find out that it's not as simple as a bumper sticker slogan of critical race theory, crack cocaine's an example, because meth has the same penalties, and that's pretty much a white drug as an example. Plus, just to fill in the gaps for you, the crack cocaine, getting tough on crack cocaine in the early to mid 80s. How did we get tough on crime? We got tough on crime. What was the solution, right, in our country? The socially constructed solution to bad behavior was what? Punitive, jail time. And in this case, the Black Caucus, which, the Black senators and Black House of Representatives, they were promoting getting tough on, because it was affecting their communities, right? It was affecting Black kids. It was cheap, and it was out there, and it was just crazy, and it was killing kids and hooking kids and gangs, and the criminal element within neighborhoods. It was, and the Black community was crying out to politicians and the media and pastors and community leaders that we got to put this to a stop. And so Congress took action, and they got tough on crack. So that's kind of the history of that. The Obama administration and Attorney General Eric Holder, reduced to some degree the punitive penalty for crack. So yeah, it's quite an interesting history, and more complex than just a simple I believe or I think type statement, right? You got to support those kind of things, hopefully. Okay. And then critical construction is kind of like what we talked about right there, right? Where there's like this inequality, critical theory, right? Or conflict theory, basically the same thing, married with social construction or interactionism, right? And you kind of what we just did in with the whole meth deals, like understanding how we socially constructed the meaning of crack and the penalties of crack, that social construction, along with critical theory of inequality, right? So it's an understanding the changes over time in that as well. Okay, so deviant theories of interactionist theories. Okay, so we've done functionalism, we did critical theory or conflict theory, and now symbolic interactionism or interactionist theories. So symbolic interactionism, the definition of deviance is relative, right? And it depends on the culture, the time period, and the situation, right? It's socially constructed. So deviance is socially constructed, which means if deviance is socially constructed, that defines the social norm. And that also then becomes what? Socially constructed. And the sanctions of what's allowed to sanction people to what degree is also socially constructed. Okay. Yeah, what comes to mind is kind of interesting, right? Is like the Salem witch trials, right? So yeah, kind of interesting. Okay, so Sutherland's differential association theory or learning theory, right? That basically says that crime is taught, that it's caught, through socialization within like a family. Typically, Sutherland was focused on, family socialization through family. So it's learning theory, right? It's differential association. So differential association means that here's one family system here, here's another family system here. We're comparing the difference of these two family structures or systems that have this association, right? And some families have a higher propensity, right, of crime, and that's taught through socialization. That's Sutherland's differential association theory, right? And deviance, it resides within, right, the socialization process or the family, right? This is a good family. This is a bad criminal family. This is a good family, right? Okay. Criminal behavior is learned by interacting with close friends and family members. That's part of Sutherland's differential theory. And then there's labeling theory. Okay, labeling theory is we're going to deviance results from being labeled a deviant, right? And it really is the study on how a behavior goes from being a deviant behavior into a deviant person. So, Dennis the Menace, the Mitchells, Mitchell and his wife and his kid, Dennis, they move into the neighborhood and this cute little kid, Dennis, oh, Dennis, you're such a cute little kid. The next thing you know, he's being, a 9-year-old boy, and trying to figure out how to hit rocks with a tennis racket. And he hits one across the street and bang, it goes right through the window of Mr. Wilson's window, and things like that. All of a sudden, this deviant act of breaking a window, right, is associated with a person or a group, right, if we're looking at a macro perspective. And Dennis all of a sudden becomes not the cute little kid, he becomes Dennis the Menace, right? And we can look at that as an example of application that's easy to look at, right? And then we treat, based on that label, right, social construction or symbolic interactionism or the social construction of meaning, right? So Dennis becomes a symbol, right? That meaning is given to that symbol of what? Criminal, right? We might look at, like, say, the label of felon or pedophile, or we might even take it into race, like being Black or a person of color, or being a gang member, or I don't know, we could look at all kinds of labels. One might, maybe we label undocumented immigration or immigrants, right, as a group, right, or political groups as deviant, or religious people as deviant, maybe like after 9/11, right, labeling Muslims as deviant. So yeah, we kind of scapegoating theory starts to kind of creep into labeling theory, right? And then within labeling theory, there's like this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So we go back to a previous chapter on the concept of self-concept. And my self-concept comes from how I perceive others perceive me. So if I'm Dennis, the happy kid and the new kid in the neighborhood, and hey, he's a cute little kid, all of a sudden I get labeled and people start treating me based on that label, right? Interactionism, right? We act or react based on the meaning that we give that label, right? Start treating me I start to see others or perceive others or treating me or seeing me as a deviant, right? Then I start to see myself that way, and I start to fulfill that prophet, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy of the label. And then there's the primary and secondary deviance, right? Primary is the original violation of the norm, right? Which then becomes or can become, and these are, doesn't always become self-fulfilling prophecy. It doesn't always become secondary deviance, but there is a pattern, right? Is what we look for, where primary, the original crime, then becomes a label and the person becomes the deviant, and it creates secondary deviance. So the person starts acting out in that, with that label or that status. Okay, so that is interactionism, some differential association theory or learning theory, and labeling theory. And then of course there is a stigma of deviance, right? And the stickiness of that stigma that goes with labeling. How sticky is that label? Or I'm sorry, how sticky is the stigma attached to that label, right? Okay. Real quick, that's kind of interesting. Now we've kind of put a twist on this, the social construction of armpits and hair, right? So a number of years ago, right, it became kind of this cool thing, right, to be male, right? Shaving your armpit, shaving your chest. That's also a social construction, you know? So symbolic interactionism, right, would start looking at this and would say, well, is that deviant? I mean, I think at first, when it first hit the scenes, it was breaking from the social norm. Now, one thing about social norms as well is when social norms are challenged, right, it changes, right, it opens up, right? And tattoos are a great example, and piercings are a great example of this, right? When tattoos and piercings a number of years ago started kind of coming on the scene, ooh, man, bad, deviant, sanction, right? But the more those social norms are challenged, the more it opened up, right, a greater tolerance for inclusive behaviors, traits, and beliefs. And in this case, it would be traits, right? So yeah, I'll let you kind of play with that for a little bit, but it's kind of interesting, right? From a social construction and changes over time, and which groups and how that happened to change because we challenged the status quo or the social norms, right? So kind of cool. Okay, so additional deviant behaviors, routine activities theory. Might be a good time to take a break, or we're going to go through a couple before you hit the criminal justice system. You can take a break then if you want as well, or an additional break if you want. So routine activities theory basically says when there are three things that coincide in the same time and place, you're going to get an increase in deviant behavior. And motivated or likely offender, so somebody's motivated, okay, and there's a suitable target. Ooh, okay. Like, for example, I'm tired of walking. I want a bike. I'm motivated to steal a bike. Ooh, look, I see there's a bike over there. And it's unlocked. And there's an absence of a capable guardian. Either there's an absence of a lock, there's nobody looking, there's no cameras. Man, that bike is mine. I mean, who would leave a bike out unlocked, right? Of course, you start justifying stuff, but basically, now this is also sometimes named rape theory, right? Same kind. So think of as far as like rape theory, right? Likely offender, absence of a capable guardian, and a suitable target, right? So the convergence in time and space of these routine activity theory, right? It's a very general kind of the criticism on this theory is, what motivates a likely offender, right? So it's kind of assumed. They don't, this theory doesn't spend a lot of time on explaining or supporting what could lead to or how we get to a motivated or likely offender. But at any rate, it's kind of looking at these three, and that's called a Venn diagram. When those three things overlap, you're going to get a higher rate of, according to this, a higher percentage of crime is going to exist when those three are in place. Okay, pretty simple. All right, deviant subcultures. This is really fascinating, right? So it's a culture theory of deviance, right? And basically, there's different variations of this, but okay, so Cohen's status frustration theory in 1955, he focused on boys that were poor performance in high school, okay, which reduces their status and self-esteem. I mean, makes sense, okay. And he studied this, he's got the support, the data, the research, the objective quantitative data on this, and it leads to regaining status and self-esteem by joining gangs, right? So I can get my status and self-esteem if I'm failing in this area, right? I can get it in gangs, right? And then of course there's deviance within the gangs, right? Okay. Walter Miller's focal concerns, right? A taste for trouble, right? His theory was that that some people have a taste for trouble, or they get something out of toughness or cleverness or that excitement, right? This cultural socialization that happens within this space, within groups, right? Okay, within cultures, within subcultures, right? Within groups. And then Wolfgang and Ferracuti's subculture of violence thesis says that what? A subculture of violence promotes a violent response, right? Okay, so yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think the other thing, let me go back. I think the other thing too, from a general like culture, I'll go to the top, like culture theory, right? So you start getting into like ethnocentrism, right? So in America, we say what, that in most states, our socially constructed norm for marriage is 18, unless you in some states have a parental permission, maybe as early as 16. But in our culture, we say no, 12-year-old child brides is deviant. That's how we've socially constructed that, right? So if you come from another culture, right, or you have a different set of beliefs within a subculture, right, that says no, our culture believes that child brides at 12 years old are totally normal, right? Your values and beliefs are going to be considered deviant based on cultural differences, right? Culture theory, right? So the dominant culture, again, tends to have the greatest influence over social norms and the sanctions of violations of those socially constructed norms. And so differences in culture then create, because of these differences, deviant subcultural groups. Wow. I mean, that's fascinating. But even just think along racial and ethnic lines, right? The difference between, say, a Western European, if you want to racialize it, white culture, right? Compared to, if you want to racialize the other cultures, right? A Black culture or Hispanic culture or an Asian culture, right? Differences in cultural values, beliefs, and social norms, because part of culture, remember, is the social construction of a social norm. So an Asian social norm may be different than a Western American cultural dominant, that cultural norm. And that creates what? Deviance, right? Because of its social construction and the differences between cultures. Fascinating stuff. Okay, additional deviant theory, social disorganization theory. This says, so the other one said what? That deviance is within a culture or subcultures, right? This one says that deviance is located within neighborhoods, right? That's the influence, right? Also known as the Chicago School and social disorganization theory, or related to broken windows theory, right? As a way to fix high crime rates and reduce crime rates. based on the Chicago school, right? Certain social and physical characteristics of urban neighborhoods contribute to high crime rates, right? So what they did was in Chicago, right, at Chicago University, they looked at this neighborhood that had high crime rates, this neighborhood that had low crime rates, and they said, what's the difference? And they said neighborhoods with high crime rates were high in poverty, high in dilapidation, and so things were broken down, torn down, broken windows. Population density, high population density. Population turnover, people didn't want to stay there very long, so you didn't have people that were bought into keeping, you didn't have a lot of neighborhood watch. Nobody spoke out against deviant behavior because, like, I don't want to cause waves, I just want to get out of here alive, right? And single parent households, another one that's not mentioned in this is it tends to be a diverse neighborhood, right? A culturally diverse neighborhood. So you've got a lot of different cultural disparities of social norms and behaviors. And so that also can create a lot of, and, depending on what you read, these 5 may be a little different than the other, but that's generally those 5 plus to what I just told you is typically culturally diverse, right? Okay. And you can pause it and look at this feedback loop because I don't want, it's getting kind of long, but I just wanted to add that in there, the social disorganization theory feedback loop, really kind of interesting. Okay. Might be a good time to take a break, kind of just stand up, stretch, pause, come back later, come back in a few minutes. Okay, got about 10 or 15 minutes left. Crime and the criminal justice system, maybe 15 or 20, but okay. Criminal justice system, right? Criminal justice, what is the criminal justice? It's made up of police, courts, and punishment. Okay, so law enforcement, right? The courts, right? Legislation, right, comes out of legislation, right, comes laws, right? But then in the criminal justice system, you have police that are law enforcement, which is in the executive branch, right? Courts, right, which then determine guilt or not guilt, and then punishment, which are the consequences, right? So that's the criminal justice system. Why do we punish, right? Why do we punish? Well, punishment promotes a deterrence of crime, right? It deters people from breaking the law. Now, does it 100%? No, it reduces crime rates, right? Okay, if there was no consequences, people, more people would commit crimes. Okay, retribution, right? So it provides a collective retribution. So instead of having a bunch of vigilantes out there making right what went wrong, it's like, oh, you broke into my house, now I'm going to go break into your house, right? We don't want a bunch of vigilantes. So we want to provide socially, right, a means of retribution that is orderly, instead of having a bunch of vigilantes. Okay, removal, right? We give a lot of chances in this country, very few people, unless it's like probably murder, or very few people on a first offense go to jail. I mean, it has to be pretty darn serious, like first degree, whatever, or grand theft, whatever, right? But usually you get fined, maybe you get a little probation, that kind of stuff, right? So, but eventually, if you keep breaking the law, right, like the 3 strikes and you're out was kind of an idea of, if you keep breaking felony laws, right, if you keep breaking violent felony crimes and it's your 3rd time, then, to protect society, we're going to take you out, give you a timeout, right? We're going to remove you from society and hopefully rehabilitate you, right? Rehabilitation, right? Or total institutionalization, resocialization, right? Rehabilitation, resocialization. Of course, rehabilitation is a tough go, right? It gets kind of a bad name, but when you think about human beings and change, right? I mean, like the famous author Mark Twain said, quitting smoking is easy. I've done it millions of times, right? I mean, you see newspaper or magazine racks at the checkout stands, with every spring we see start a new diet, right? We have Alcoholics Anonymous. It's really hard to change, right? Habits are hard to change, right? Mindsets are hard to change. So it's a tough job on the prison system. And I think we could do a better job, yes, but also I think to understand that change for human beings, especially over a pattern of, a pattern that's existed for years, if not decades, is tough, right? Okay. Real quick, here's what they call this is called a crime pyramid. In this case, it's a violent crime arrests report. And I know, so this is a violent crime pyramid, but basically it's an example of, so the full triangle says these are all the crimes, in this case, violent crimes, right, that were committed, okay? But some at the very bottom, we don't know about, right? We don't know. There might've been some violent crimes committed that they're unknown, right? Maybe the victim and the perpetrator know, but the society doesn't, right? And then, okay, so then the next level up, it's called the NCVS reported crimes, right? National Crime Victims Survey, National Crimes Victim Survey. So the government sends out random surveys and says, hey, has somebody committed a violent, in this case, a violent crime, but any crime against you? So a number of years ago, somebody took a baseball bat, probably out on a Friday night, having a joyride, driving by, whacked my mailbox and tore it down, right? Well, that's a $150 mailbox, right? I'm not going to call the police. They're not going to catch the person. My deductible on my insurance is $200. I'm not going to report it to that, so I don't need a police report. So it's going to go unreported unless I get the survey and say, yeah, I had a property crime, right? Or I was in a bar fight, but nobody ever, called the cops, so it didn't get reported, right? And then the UCR report is the Uniform Crime Report. That's the FBI kind of gathers from those crimes that have been reported to law enforcement, right? And of course, those are reported crimes. And then out of those, a small portion are arrested. Okay. So they've collected they've actually investigated, because a lot of crimes that are reported, go investigate it. Hey, my house got broken into, it's reported, but they're not going to go out. They're not going to put a detective on it to go out and look for somebody that took your laptop out, broke through your window and took your laptop. Right? So not all are going to result in arrests. And of those arrests, a very small percentage of those actually get convictions. So most crimes go, if you want to use a clip, unpunished. By far more crimes go unpunished. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, crime. There are over 12 million arrests each year in the US. 12 million arrests. And that's that little top pyramid, right? At the very top, that little tiny piece of all the crimes that are committed. So 12 million arrests each year in the US. Wow. I mean, that's pretty amazing, right? Over 50 million police public contacts each year, right? So police, and 12 million is part of that, right? So of the other 38 million interactions between police and the public that are non-arrests, there are police officers that have interacted 50 million times between police and public, sometimes multiple contacts with the same person, but okay. Over 700,000 law enforcement officers, right? Wow, maybe a few less now, but because there's a lot of retirement, we're low on police officers, but 700,000 law enforcement officers, man, that's amazing. And the perspectives of crime and social construction of crisis, right? So what is your perspective of crime and social construction of a crime crisis, right? What is our society's perspectives of crime? What have we socially constructed? Is crime high? Is crime low? What about our prisons? Is there mass incarceration? What is mass incarceration? If you had to quantify mass incarceration, what would that look like? 10% of the people in jail, 20%, 50%? What is, if I said, hey, I've got a mass cheating problem in my class, what percent of my class would have to be cheating on a final exam for there to be a mass problem, right? So conventional crimes, which entail violent crimes, property crime, and then there's white collar crimes, right, which are not the conventional type crimes. And then what some people call victimless crimes, right? Drug crimes would be maybe considered victimless crimes, right? Prostitution or pornography might be considered, often is considered a victimless crime. Of course, the more we interact with each other, the more collective we become. Not sure that there's such a thing. One could argue maybe there's not such a thing as victimless crimes, because these affect society at large to some degree. That's that kind of freedom, collective responsibility. It's like what we're grappling with today. And then measuring crime. So we do measure crime, and here's the type of, we talked earlier about the Uniform Crime Report and the National Crime Victim Survey, right? And so this kind of gives you kind of that crime pyramid. This kind of gives you, and of this, there's a small percentage that are actually arrested, right? But look at this, for violent crimes, there's almost what? There's 3 times more crimes that have been measured by the victim survey than are reported based on the FBI's UCR. Property crime, not as much. I think property crime probably gets, well, obviously it does, it gets reported more often, right? Or yeah, property crime does. But the total, you can see that of those that get reported to the police and those from the victims survey, half of those get reported. So kind of interesting. You kind of look at that a little bit and think about that. So 50% of crimes that actually happen that people would report actually get reported to the police, and of those, a small percentage get actually end in arrests, and of those, a very small percentage actually end up being found guilty, and of those, a very small percentage actually end up incarcerated in jail or prison. And we'll take a look at that in a sec. Okay, so crime and incarceration. Of the US, 5% of the population in the US is the world population, right? So, but, and it's a little less now because our incarceration rates have dropped, right? But we account for about 5% of the world's population. But if you took all the people that were incarcerated, we would have 25%, or I think it's about 22 or 23% now, of global incarcerated, 25% of the global population we have incarcerated in the US. Why is that? Is it because we're a punitive incarceration nation? Or is it because we are, maybe we're a criminal nation? Maybe we do commit more crimes, right? Maybe there's something, maybe we're both. Maybe we are great risk takers, right? We do, tend to enjoy our drugs, our, highs, part of that risk taking as well, that kind of, or maybe it's like society, the pressure of our capitalist society puts pressure on, outcomes, and, Merton's strain theory, right, says we're going to innovate or deviate, right, to get that American dream. That's a great question as to why, right? It's a great question. So part of it is 3 strikes laws, right? 25 years in 3 strikes laws. 28 states out of the 50 states is into their state law, which, by the way, most criminal law is state law. Most criminal law is state law, right? And what that means basically is that someone has committed a felony, a violent felony, right? Murder, kidnapping, sexual abuse, rape, or aggravated assault, aggravated robbery, 3 times, okay? And that's the 3 strikes law. Maybe it's because there's a population bubble, right? That we have a high incidence of people that are going through our population system that have bubbled when we skyrocketed in incarceration rate. Maybe it's because the boomers, right, which were born between 1946 and 1964, right, that bubble of boomers came of what they call criminal age, right, as right toward the end of the 60s, right, mid to late 60s and early 70s, right, and crime and incarceration rates skyrocketed. You know, maybe there's an increase in police force, right? Federal money is going to police. Maybe we've cracked down, we've got tough on crime, right? And maybe we got tough on crime because there was an increase in crime. You know, typically, if there's no crime and you run as a politician on getting tough on crime and there's not an increase in crime, it's going to be tough to get elected, right? Okay. And then longer sentencing, maybe it's because we've created this minimum sentencing. I hear that a lot. Maybe minimum sentencing has increased longer stays, right? And more population of the incarcerated, right? And then also the reason why might be because of culture, might be because of poverty, education or lack thereof, could be racism. So you see, this is very complex as to why we have such high incarceration rates. And it's probably a lot of all of those things put together and not just one. We like to say, we like to kind of pick on one thing or maybe kind of a choice between one or two things and then give one reason for that, right? Oh, we are a incarceration nation because of racism, or it's because of poverty, or because of three strikes laws, or, you know, so, but it's complex. And let's take a look at incarceration rates. So this is gross incarceration rates from 1920 to 2014. And you can see, you know, it's been kind of now these are gross numbers. This isn't a percentage, this isn't per capita, right? And so as the population increases, you would expect, right, without any other influence, you would expect, just based on population increase, you would expect it to go up slightly. And maybe that's why, I don't know, but that's one. But somewhere in, say, 1980, right, boom, up goes our prison population, right? Up goes our prison population. Now, some people say it was Nixon's get tough on crime. You know, let's get tough on crime. Well, Nixon came into office in 68. So right here, and he was, I think he was out and impeached, or no, he didn't get impeached. He resigned before impeachment, but right in this, like, kind of, I don't think if Nixon is responsible for the increase in incarceration, boy, he did a terrible job of it. Now, Reagan was elected in 1980, right? And he got war on drugs, right? War on drugs. He and Nancy Reagan, war on drugs, war on drugs, war on drugs. But that didn't start until, you know, 1982 to 84, kind of right in that, which is right here, but it was already starting to skyrocket. So I don't know. And of course, then three strikes you're out was Clinton, right? And the three strikes you're out, that was like because Clinton got tough on crime in order to get elected, to take away that argument from the Republicans. And so that was 92. He got into office in 93, but it was already on its way. So I don't know. Are we creating scapegoats? Are we demonizing politicians where it's maybe bigger than, I don't know, let's take a look. Maybe there's some other answers, and we talked about them earlier. But look at, here's the total crime, right? So I found a transparency of crime, right? And you can see I matched it with the incarceration numbers, right? And I matched it over the time frame, right? As you look down here, right? 1990s right here, 1960s right there. So I kind of shrunk it as an overlay. And you can see what happened to crime. Well, in 1962 or 3, crime started going up. In fact, from 1965, or let's even talk from 1966 to 19, so within 10 years, crime doubled. Wow. In 1 decade, crime doubled. Do you think there's people going to outcry about, and maybe the media help, maybe politicians help kind of focus and spur on that, right? And this is, okay, and in 2 decades, crime tripled. Wow. And then not even within the next decade, it almost quadrupled, right? Within that extra, wow. So it's funny how that curve matches incarceration. Huh. So, but why did crime go up, right? That's what we sociologists ask. We're curious cats, like, why did crime go up? Oh, let's talk about the baby boomers, right? And here's the fertility bubble, right? Now, this is not cumulative, right? This is, so I took the fertility rate and I made a 20-year adjustment, which kind of puts it at that age of crime, right? 18 to 28. Some people say 15 to 30, but 18 to 28. And so I moved the baby boom fertility rate bubble over to the age of crime. And I'll be dang, look at that. That might be why, to some degree, right? It was also a very tumultuous time in our country's history, right? You had civil rights and a lot of civil unrest, right? But we got through that until the 1980s. And then you had what? You had the war protests, but that was in the late 60s and early 70s. Not much happened, right? But eventually, right, now crime did go down, and you'll start to see that if you go out another 10 years, you'll see this start to go down. So kind of interesting, right? Now, so how many people are locked up in the United States? Less than 1% of the population are currently incarcerated. And I'll let you kind of freeze at some point. You can freeze when you want. Look at this, but you have local jails. That's a year sentence or less. Less than a year, you go to a local county jail. If you get sentenced to more than a year, then you go to a state prison. Most all this is done on the state level. Now the federal, right, is in here. And it just recently, the drug at the federal level, 50%, and it's just under 50% now, but at this time, a few years ago, 50% or roughly 50% were incarcerated in federal prisons because of drugs. Less than 0.5% of those were because of use. It's all drug dealing, drug transportation, big time operators at the federal level, big time operators, right? So these aren't drug users, these are drug dealers, right? And it's 50% of the federal prison, right? So you have 100,000 of just under 3 million. So you've got about probably less than 3% total. I'm thinking of, I mean, you can do crunch the numbers. And then of course, here's juvenile and immigration detention right here. And then you can see of the state, at the state level, where a little over half the people are in state prisons, right? About half of those are due to violent crime. Assault, robbery, rape, sexual assault, manslaughter, murder, pretty distributed between those. And then you have property crime, and then you have drug crime. Okay, here's drug possession right here. And this is possession at the dealer level. Most of those fit at the dealer level, and then transportation, manufacture, and selling, right? Distribution, and then public disorder, right? So really interesting to really take a look at. So really, when you think of drug crimes for using, right? So we've got like less than 0.5% of 3%, and you have a very small, so of going to jail for using drugs is pretty small percentage, less than, I can't even imagine, it's less than 1%, for using, that you end up in jail. Okay, or prison, incarcerated. But this big pie chart, right, with about trying to think of how many million, but about probably 280 million, no, 2.8 million, right, out of 330 million people in the country, or 3 million, so less than 1%, right? This pie chart represents this piece right here, right? The orange, kind of yellow and green, right? But most people, when you get in trouble, when you violate a formalized law, you go on probation, right? You go on probation. Oh, here, correctional facilities, 2.3 million. Wow, I was a little high. So yeah, about 2.3 million out of 330 million is probably, yeah, probably like 0.7%, something like that. So less than 1%. And then parole, which means you're out early from prison and you're on parole. So it's kind of probation, but probation after you go to prison. Okay. And the last one of the last slides, we talk about the prison industrial complex, privatized prisons. So again, another slogan, bumper sticker, opinion, I think piece, right? That is more complex than that. So of all state and federal prison populations, only 8 to 9% reside in privatized prisons. You're talking about a very small percentage of those incarcerated go to prison in privatized prisons, right? Now, we privatize road construction, right? But there's a watchdog, we call those inspectors, right? And those inspectors make sure that people that are building roads and bridges that are private and doing it for the government, they do a bid and the government okays it and then they watch. So the same thing happens in privatized prisons. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to actually do some studies. You'd have to do research. You'd have to come up with objective data that suggests a hypothesis instead of having an unsupported opinion that you regurgitated from a late night comedy news show or something, right? Okay. So what does the research show? Well, studies suggest, gosh, at best, a mixed bag. And crime statistics research is so hard to gain a good body of knowledge, right, that supports, that does a good job of supporting a hypothesis. So is the privatized prison good or bad? It's a mixed bag at best. And here's one example of the problem, okay? Most of these are at the state level, right? And different states have different laws. And so you're comparing apples to oranges, right? Also, some inmates start out in state and end up in private, or start in private and end up in state. Some states say, if you've done violent crime, you go to a state prison. In other states, if you commit violent crime, you go to the private prison. And so you're comparing, say one state puts violent criminals, into privatized prison, the other does property crime. So you're really not comparing. You see what you're comparing? You're comparing apples to oranges because you're comparing different criminals, right? Or you're comparing different people based on crimes that are different crimes. So if you're looking for, say, how well is the private prison doing for recidivism rates, right? Anyway, the point is, it's a mixed bag at best. More study needs to be done. I'm sure there are people doing those studies. It's important, I think, in our culture to do those studies, and not only do studies on differences between private, but maybe studies, and we're doing those as well, on the criminal justice system itself, right? And are there alternatives to kind of this American punitive system? And we can look to other countries. Now, part of the challenge when we look to other countries, like say Sweden or Norway or Finland, is it's a different culture. They have different values, different beliefs, different social norms, right? Their behaviors are different of what's acceptable, right? So obviously their system suits them probably better than our system. Their system suits us. And our system suits us far better than our system would suit them. But maybe we can work toward, right, a better system, which we are, I think. So if you want to get more deep into is the criminal justice system racist, right? The new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander, her hypothesis is it is, right? The War on Cops, which is Heather McDonald's more recent book, kind of goes into a little bit, but Heather McDonald has a lot of other pieces out there. She says it's not the criminal justice system that's racist, right? And she supports that hypothesis. And a most recent book from, it's probably a few years old now, but the most recent one is Locked In, The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform by John Pfaff. Good book, most recent, data-based, supported, very interesting if you're into more information on the prison system, right, and incarceration. Okay, so that is the long version of the criminal justice system. Hope that's been helpful, informative, has challenged you with questions to get you to think, use your critical thinking skills, and maybe even dig in and do a little bit of research on your own. And then when you find some good answers or some aha moments, come share with me or us. All right. Well, take care, and we'll see you for the next version next time. Bye.